It all started pretty normally until a new neighbor moved in with his noisy kids and habits that I just couldn't stand. At first, I tried to ignore it, but gradually he started pushing my buttons. I began to wonder, could I do something to reclaim my peace without confronting him directly? That's when I discovered a rather unique way to handle the situation. I had been living in my peaceful little neighborhood for 5 years, and it was everything I had ever wanted. A quiet, self-contained community with separate houses close to one another, yet no one ever bothered to interact. No lawns to maintain, no noisy neighbors, and absolutely no kids running around causing chaos. The driveways were large and shared, but everyone parked their cars respectfully, minding their own business. There was a small park down the street, a mere 30-second walk away for those who wanted a slice of nature. But for me, the neighborhood was perfect, serene, private, and free from the usual disturbances that plague so many others. Then, about a year ago, things changed. It started with the arrival of a new neighbor, a man with a lot of little kids. At first, there was nothing remarkable about it. He moved in, parked his large truck in the shared motor court, and I just drove past like I always did. I kept to myself, as I always did, and there was no reason to think this would be any different from the previous years. But over time, his presence began to disturb the quiet balance of the neighborhood. He wasn't one to stay inside, and I noticed he began setting up lawn chairs right in front of his neighbor's garage, where he would allow his kids to run wild and scream. It wasn't just a one-off event. Every time I drove past, there they were, cluttering the driveway, racing around and blocking the way. I had to drive carefully, slowing down to avoid hitting one of them. It was becoming impossible to ignore the disruptions. What really pushed it over the edge was the noise. On weekends, around 8 a.m., the sound of his motorcycle revving would wake me from my sleep. The harsh, loud noise echoed through the entire neighborhood, cutting through the calm like a knife. My peaceful mornings, once filled with the quiet sounds of birds or the gentle hum of my refrigerator, were now shattered by the sound of his engine roaring to life. It felt like an assault on the stillness I had cherished for so long. And then there was the issue with his kids. They would often block the driveway, taking their sweet time to move whenever I had to back my car out. The situation got worse when he started waving at me whenever I drove past, expecting a greeting in return. I didn't wave back. In fact, I didn't acknowledge him at all. It was a small act, but it was enough to rile him up. At first, he waved more. Then, he started shouting at me as I drove past. His kids even got in on the act, stopping what they were doing just to stand and wave at me. I ignored them all, but it didn't seem to sit well with him. It was like he couldn't accept that I wanted nothing to do with him or his family. One day, as I was pulling into my garage, he walked right up to my car, shouting as he went. I closed the garage door behind me, right in his face, without even looking at him. It was the most satisfying moment. He stood there for a second, seething with anger, before turning around and walking to my front door. I could see him through my window, staring at the doorbell camera. He turned and left as soon as he realized I was watching. It was becoming clear to me that this man was not going to just leave me alone, and his behavior was becoming more invasive. But I couldn't just sit back and let it continue. I had to do something. The situation with my new neighbor was quickly spiraling out of control. I had always prided myself on keeping to myself, on being the kind of person who respected other people's space and expected the same in return. But now it seemed that my neighbor couldn't accept that. He was determined to force some sort of interaction between us, whether I wanted it or not. At first, it was the subtle things, more waves, more shouting, more demands for my attention. But it wasn't just harmless behavior anymore. He was actively trying to provoke me. Every time I drove past, he would make sure to wave, and if I didn't wave back, he would shout after me, his voice carrying down the driveway. It was almost like a game to him, testing the boundaries, seeing how far he could push me without me snapping. But I wasn't interested in playing his game. I was already frustrated with the constant noise, the blocked driveway, and the general intrusion into my peaceful life. The last thing I needed was his childish antics. One afternoon, as I pulled into my garage, I noticed him standing in the motor court again. His kids were running wild around the place, just like they always did. As I tried to park, I had to stop short to avoid running over one of the little ones who had decided to play in the driveway, completely oblivious to the car. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but today, something snapped inside me. I rolled down my window and honked my horn. Not once, but for a solid 3 seconds. I wanted him to know how unacceptable it was that he let his kids run around the driveway like that, without any care for the safety of the people living here. The sound of the horn was loud and sharp, echoing off the walls of the surrounding houses. It was enough to get his attention, but not in the way I'd hoped. Instead of taking responsibility for his actions, he stood there frozen for a moment, glaring at me. For a brief second, I thought he might walk over and try to confront me again. But instead, he turned and started directing his kids to move out of the way. His face was red with anger, and for a moment I almost expected him to march over and yell at me for honking. But he didn't. Instead, he stood there, his hands on his hips, muttering something under his breath while his kids slowly shuffled out of the way. I could feel the tension in the air as I backed my car into the garage, the whole situation hanging between us like a heavy cloud. I knew it wasn't going to end here. He wasn't the type of person who just backed down, and he wasn't the type to let things go. He had made it clear that he was going to keep pushing, keep trying to force some sort of interaction between us until I responded the way he wanted. But I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. As I closed the garage door behind me, I had a sense of resolve. I wasn't going to let this go on any longer. I wasn't going to continue pretending like everything was fine while he pushed my boundaries further and further. But I also knew I didn't want a direct confrontation. I didn't want to give him the chance to escalate things any further. That's when I began to think of a different approach, one that would deal with him without giving him the opportunity to argue or try to manipulate the situation in his favor. It wasn't going to be a simple solution, but I was determined to make him understand that I wasn't going to be a part of his games anymore. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't have to deal with his antics alone. There were rules in place, and it was time to use them to my advantage. After that incident with the honking, I was beyond frustrated. It felt like my neighbor was purposefully trying to push me into a confrontation, and I had had enough. I didn't want to get into a screaming match with him, and I certainly didn't want to escalate things to violence or physical altercations. But the tension in the air was palpable. Every time I drove past his house, I could feel him watching, waiting for a reaction from me. I knew if I didn't act soon, this cycle of annoyance would only continue, and I would never get my peace back. That's when the idea hit me. Why not fight fire with fire, but in a way that was totally legal and within the rules? There were certain things in our community that were strictly regulated, and I realized I could use those rules to my advantage. I didn't care about the rules per se, but this was about restoring the balance of my life and making it clear to him that I wouldn't tolerate his behavior any longer. I started paying much closer attention to the things he was doing, looking for every little violation I could report. The first thing that came to mind was his truck. The motor court, which was meant to remain clear for emergency access, was always blocked by his large truck. This wasn't just an occasional slip-up, it was a regular habit, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it was illegal. I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed it sooner. He was blatantly disregarding the fire lane rule, and I was going to make sure it didn't go unnoticed any longer. The next time I drove by, I took out my phone and snapped a picture of his truck parked in the motor court. I had evidence now, solid proof that he was breaking the rule. That night, I filed a report with the HOA, attaching the photo for good measure. I knew he wouldn't be happy about it, but I didn't care. The next morning, as I was pulling out of my garage, I saw a HOA enforcement vehicle parked across the street. They were ticketing his truck. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction as I drove past, seeing him standing outside, talking to the officer with a frustrated look on his face. It was a start. But I wasn't finished yet. There were plenty more violations to report. I'd seen him leave his garage door wide open for hours, which was another rule the HOA enforced strictly. I knew he didn't care about the rule, but it gave me another opportunity to push back without direct confrontation. So, over the next few weeks, I kept an eye on his garage, waiting for him to leave it open again. It didn't take long. One afternoon, I saw it standing wide open just like before. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone, snapped a picture, and sent off another report to the HOA. I wasn't even sure if he was aware of the impact my reports were having on him, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the pressure started to get to him. Each time I reported him, I could feel the satisfaction growing. I was taking back control of my neighborhood without having to confront him directly. His truck got ticketed again, and his kid's playhouse, which had been set up next to his garage, was eventually ordered to be removed. Each violation was like a small victory, and it was becoming clear that he was starting to realize he couldn't get away with his behavior. But the real question was, would he back down or would he try to escalate things even further? I didn't know yet, but I was ready to keep pushing. I was determined to get my peace and quiet back, one report at a time. The pressure on my neighbor continued to build, and I could see the frustration written all over his face whenever I drove past. It was becoming more obvious that my constant reporting was starting to have an effect on him. He was clearly fed up, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him. He had brought this on himself by disregarding the rules and forcing his way into my space. As far as I was concerned, he had made his bed, and now he was lying in it. One afternoon, as I was driving home, I saw him standing in front of his garage, talking to a couple of neighbors who were out on their driveways. I could tell he was agitated, his arms flailing in the air as he explained something to them. It looked like he was trying to justify his actions, maybe even complaining about the reports I had filed. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could imagine what he was saying. Why is she doing this? It's just a few kids running around. Why can't she just mind her business? The thought of him venting to my neighbors about me made me smirk, but it also made me realize something. He was starting to notice how much attention I was paying to his behavior, how closely I was watching him. He was becoming self-conscious. That alone was enough to reassure me that my efforts weren't in vain. But I knew he wouldn't just roll over and give up. If anything, he'd probably try to retaliate. A few days later, I pulled into the driveway, and as usual, I saw his kids playing in the motor court, right where I had to park. I slowed down and honked my horn for a couple of seconds, just enough to make my point. But this time, something unexpected happened. He came rushing out of his garage, storming toward my car, his face red with anger. I could see him coming, and I knew this confrontation was inevitable. He was tired of being the target of my reports, and now he wanted to do something about it. As he approached my car, I stayed calm, keeping my hands on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed ahead. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flustered. "Are you serious?" he yelled as he got closer. "What's your problem? Why are you doing this? I'm just trying to live here like everyone else." I didn't respond right away. I knew if I said anything, it would just give him fuel to keep going. Instead, I let the silence hang in the air, and he seemed to grow angrier the longer I stayed quiet. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he continued, his voice rising. "Reporting me over every little thing, hiding behind your phone like some coward. You're ridiculous." I still didn't say a word. I didn't need to. His outburst only reinforced what I already knew, that my actions were working. He was rattled, and I could see it in his eyes. The satisfaction of knowing I had gotten under his skin was hard to hide, but I kept my composure. At that moment, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway distracted him for a second, and he turned to see another neighbor arriving home. It was like a signal that the confrontation was over, for now. With one last glare in my direction, he stormed back into his garage, slamming the door behind him. I didn't feel the need to respond. Not even with a smug smile. I had already won. The pressure was getting to him, and he was visibly cracking under the strain. I knew it wouldn't be long before he realized that the longer he stayed, the more of his time would be wasted dealing with HOA violations. It was a slow game, but I was patient, and as I backed my car into my garage that evening, I couldn't help but think that this was just the beginning of the end. I didn't know when or how, but I was certain that the pressure would eventually break him. And when it did, he would leave. just like the others before him. Days passed, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood seemed to grow thicker with tension. I had been keeping up my relentless reporting, documenting every violation I could find. My neighbor's frustrations were becoming harder to ignore. Every time I passed by, I could feel his eyes on me, burning with annoyance. But at the same time, something had shifted. He was no longer the one calling the shots. The balance had tipped, and he knew it. The HOA had become more involved, and I could see the enforcement officers regularly driving by, checking on the complaints I had filed. I had filed so many reports that I'd lost track. The more violations I documented, the more penalties piled up against him. The parking tickets, the fines for leaving his garage door open, the removal of his children's playhouse in the motor court. The relentless pushback from the HOA was starting to get under his skin, but he still hadn't let. Then one afternoon I came home from work to see his moving truck parked in front of his house. I paused for a moment, watching from the corner of my eye as he loaded boxes into the truck, his movements hurried and frantic. At first, I couldn't believe it. Was it really happening? Was he finally packing up and leaving? I parked my car in the garage, trying to keep my cool, but my heart was racing with anticipation. I had spent months dealing with his chaos, his disregard for the rules, and his childish antics. To think that it was finally coming to an end was both satisfying and surreal. Over the next couple of hours, I saw him running in and out of the house, loading up more boxes. His kids were quiet for once, no yelling or running around in the driveway. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. It must have been a humbling experience to have his behavior result in this. But then I quickly reminded myself, he brought it on himself. He could have respected the rules, kept his kids in check, and minded his own business. But he didn't. I saw one of the HOA officers pull up around the same time, stopping by his house to check on a previous complaint. I could see them exchange a few words as the officer made a note on his clipboard. It was clear that the final straw had been reached. The enforcement was no longer just about tickets and fines. It had become a pressure point. The constant stream of reports, the fines, the enforcement, it had all contributed to his decision to leave. By the time the sun began to set, his moving truck was almost fully loaded. He was still carrying boxes, but the house was already starting to look emptier. I could see the frustration and defeat in his every step. He knew he had lost. It wasn't long before I saw him standing outside, staring at the house one last time, his hands shoved in his pocket. I almost expected him to come over and say something to me. Maybe to confront me one last time. But he didn't. Instead, he just stood there, looking like a man who had finally realized he was beaten. I didn't feel any need to gloat, even though I had every right to. I wasn't there to get revenge. All I wanted was peace. And now, it seemed that I was about to get it. That night, I went to bed with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. The neighborhood felt quieter, more peaceful. The stress of constant noise and disruption had finally been lifted. The next day, I drove past his house one last time, but this time, there were no kids running around, no truck blocking the motor court, and no more tension in the air. It was quiet, just like it should be. A few days later, the moving truck was gone, and a new neighbor had moved into his house. Someone I had never seen before. I didn't care who it was, as long as they kept to themselves and respected the rules. It had taken months of persistence, but in the end, it was worth it. I had finally gotten the peace and quiet I had been longing for. The neighborhood was mine again, and I had won without ever having to engage in a direct confrontation.